And we're recording. Cool. So this is what I've called this morning, Energy Systems Adaptation Applications, because I felt I needed a cool subtitle. And this was the best I could come up with. So I built this as a physiology talk, and that is essentially what's going on here. I think the reason I want to sort of go through this, I don't think it's vital for you guys to have any kind of grounding in physiology in order to do good training, but I do think it's beneficial for you to understand at least roughly what it is we're trying to do. And I do think some level of understanding about this helps, particularly around kind of getting why we might do stuff above or below certain thresholds, so particularly UT2 and the sort of TR stuff. And you know that there are a lot of common misconceptions out there about certain types of training and who should do it and why you do it and what it's there for. And hopefully we can head some of those off a little bit and give you a better appreciation of why I might tell you to do something in a certain way and why it might be applicable to you. So I've sort of got 3 topics which I think build on each other. So by the end of it, we should have a reasonably complete picture. If you want a kind of idea of what level this is pitched at, different energy systems is essentially sort of GCSE biology and maybe AS, A-level sort of physical education type stuff. In fact, I found a really good website for ASPE that covered this pretty well. So that's the sort of level that's coming in at. Muscle fibers, we'll just talk through the different muscle fibers and what they like to do and what they're useful for. That's maybe slightly more advanced. And then the blood lactate curve, probably slightly more advanced again. I suspect these are some of these things you've probably come across. So some of you may know a fair amount about some of this. For some of you, it may be completely new. For some of you, it might be something that you've come across in passing, but we can sort of flesh out the understanding a little bit. Things I'm intentionally not covering, even though they're quite closely related, and I'll try very hard not to sort of accidentally fall into talking about some of them. I don't want to talk about necessarily what makes any individual session effective. I don't want to talk about putting together a training plan. I don't want to talk about the sort of different models of training plans that are out there. So by that, I mean sort of types of periodization or polarized training versus not, or all that kind of thing. I don't want to talk about non-physiological inputs to training. So by that, I mean things like technical ability, or you know, whether it's hot, whether you've eaten, all of that kind of thing. I'm just going to talk about what's going on. I'm not going to talk about measuring, setting training zones. So you know, I'm not going to talk about like lactate testing or how different sort of tests or whatever fit into this. All of those things are pretty closely related to what I'm going to talk about, and probably as we're going through, some of my opinions on those things will come out, but I don't want to move into those conversations. So we're just staying sort of lower level. There is a bit of a health warning, I guess, on this. I have no formal structured training in this area, right? I'm essentially a keen amateur. So everything I'm going to cover today does sort of come from that angle and that perspective. You know, it comes from many years of reading stuff and doing sort of stuff on my own time. So for some of you, it's perfectly possible that you know more about this than I do, or that you may come across other information in your own sort of reading. So do sort of keep that in mind, right? This isn't like necessarily the 100% most nuanced truth coming from a doctorate in physiology or whatever, right? This is just some guy. But then the flip side of that is, you can get to a similar sort of understanding, I think, as me, from publicly available information pretty easily. I will plug a couple of resources that I find particularly useful, in case you do want to, get into this, or if you are starting to do your own coaching, and you want some useful tools. Neither of these are from rowing at all. They're both from other sports, and I think for particularly for exercise physiology, it can be more useful to look to other sports, just for good information, because it is ultimately all the same thing, and it's just understanding what the nuances are for rowing is the sort of difficult thing. Training for the Uphill Athlete, a manual for mountain runners and ski mountaineers, is a really good book. It's written by Scott Johnston and Steve House, who are runners and physiologists, and they roped in Kilian Jornet. For those of you who don't know who that is, he's a Catalonian runner who does sort of high altitude ultra marathon running, skimo, duathlon, sort of setting the record for running up and down Mont Blanc and running up and down Everest without oxygen and that kind of thing. He's arguably the best, certainly high altitude ultra runner ever. He's pretty exceptional if you want to look him up. Some good videos of him sort of skiing down places where nobody should ever attempt to ski down. So he sort of provides the grounding on what he actually does for his actual training. It's a really good book in that it has a really good, easy to read but quite long section on everything basically that I'm going to talk about. It just talks you through it in a really good way, and then moves on to some good training plans. But obviously it's it's targeted towards ultra runners, so it's basically do 9 hours of UT2 a day is pretty much where they come to at the end. Science of Winning, Planning, Periodization and Optimizing Swim Training by Jan Albrecht. This is maybe a slightly denser book. It's quite old. I think it was written in 2000. And you can pretty much only get it on Kindle now. It's out of print. Jan Albrecht was a Belgian swimmer, sort of world championship level swimmer, and then went on to do lactate testing, mostly for the US swim team. But he's also worked with lots of other sports. He worked with the Dutch rowing team in the 90s. I think that sort of 1996 crew that crops up on YouTube every now and then, that's sort of very relaxed rowing, I think it was that group that he worked with. The book is really around how to set up good lactate testing protocols and that kind of thing, and how to periodize your training, but it has some really good base physiology stuff in it as well. So those two are definitely sort of go-to books for me, particularly this one on the right I use for setting a lot of our training plan and getting a feel for what might be going on. So if you want to do some reading, I think the Uphill Athlete one, I think it's about £25 on Amazon. I can't remember how much I paid for the Science of Winning, but like I said, it's Kindle and it's out of print, so it's not exactly going to break the bank. Okay. Any questions, thoughts before I get into some slightly more sciencey stuff? Cool. So we're going to start by just doing a quick overview of the different energy systems, sort of what they do, how they interact, and I think probably fairly quickly off the bat we may hit into a few common misconceptions, certainly a few things back when I were a lad, when I was certainly at school and into university, a few misconceptions about different types of training, and hopefully we can head some of those off. So a little bit of science to begin with. We basically ultimately have one source of energy for everything that we do, ATP, which is effectively a molecule that stores energy for it then to be used. So when we're thinking about what's going on at a sort of a cellular level, what we're basically doing is burning ATP and then refueling it in some way to then go and burn it again. So that's like our end point that we're doing. So we're refueling ATP and then using it to do whatever, whether that's muscle contractions, whether that's to keep your heart going, whether that's to run your brain, anything like that. So every time we use a bit of that energy, we need to replenish it. There's three main energy systems that we have. Two of them don't need oxygen to replenish that ATP, and one of them does. So we have two anaerobic pathways and one aerobic pathway, basically. It doesn't matter what's used to fuel those pathways. So, you may hear about like using fat oxidation or carbohydrates or whatever. That bit is separate. There's two ways that we can process fuel to turn it into energy to be stored in ATP to be used. So the anaerobic alactate pathway or alactic pathway, so that means not in the presence of oxygen and not in the presence of lactate. Anaerobic lactate and aerobic. So the anaerobic lactate is the sort of classical anaerobic pathway, and then the aerobic is obviously using oxygen. So this anaerobic alactate is not one that we would commonly talk about that much. So that's sort of creatine phosphate system. So it's entirely separate to everything else. It's the sort of energy system that you use for like lifting weights or stroke one of a rowing of a 2K race. So it's quite different. And then anaerobic lactate is the one that we typically think of when we're talking about anaerobic exercise. Okay, let's see if I can get my notes up, otherwise I'm going to forget what I'm going to say. Oh well, never mind. So this is a graph of those different systems and sort of how they work in terms of energy output and time. So each of the systems has a sort of a time limit on it. So how long it takes for it to start working and how long it can work for. And generally speaking, they burn sort of brighter for a shorter period of time. So each of these green lines is a different energy system. The x-axis shows how long they can work for, and the y-axis shows effectively shows how much energy they produce. Important note on this graph: this is sort of saying if you were to only use that energy system, how long could it go for? And we'll come back around to sort of why that's not really the way things work in a minute. But so the first one is ATP store. So this is energy you already have sat in your cells in ATP ready to go. So it can produce a huge amount of energy, but you only have like it's one shot. So typically that's probably not going to be in any way relevant for exercise. That's going to be used for like even really simple things like standing up from a chair. it's like a short thing that your body just needs to do, and then it can get on with replenishing that ATP while you walk around, right? It's literally that sort of level. Then this one is your anaerobic alactic, so the ATP PC system, creatine phosphate system. So that lasts for about 10 seconds, and it can produce a huge amount of energy, but only for a short period of time. So this is sort of weightlifting. Similarly, stuff like getting out of a chair, walking up the stairs, like that's sort of what it really does, but we use it for weightlifting. And again, it burns really quickly because creatine phosphate is already stored in your cells waiting to be used. It doesn't know, there's no sort of difficult process for it to go through. It just is used and then it's replenished later. So when you're doing weights, this might be why I might say to have like a 2, 3, 4 minute rest between sets, which is quite a long time. If we're in the gym doing heavy weights, to have quite a long rest, because this does take a couple of minutes to replenish and then you can go again. So you'll get a more effective session by doing that. And again, for rowing, it's kind of like it's there. Yeah, we do use it. We do train it a little bit. 10-second sprints, it is there in our sort of start sequence, but it's not the most important thing in our tool bag. And then you have the lactic acid systems, which take a little bit of time to get going because there is actually a chemical process there that has to get started. They can produce quite a lot of energy, but they die out pretty quickly. So, and then your aerobic system down here, which takes a relatively long time to get going, but then once it does, can sort of keep going almost indefinitely. So even at a very low level, if you were just walking, you could, in terms of energy supply, keep walking until you ran out of fat. Right, that's literally a thing that humans can do, is you can just keep moving until you die, basically. So it has effectively infinite capacity. The reason these two look different, they're actually two parts of exactly the same process on the very low level, like at a cellular biochemical level. The lactic acid system, and this we'll come back to this later because it can be quite important. The lactic acid system is like the first step in breaking down glucose, and then the aerobic system is all of the next steps. So when you're respiring anaerobically, you're basically just doing step one over and over and over again. It produces lactate, and you just shift that out, right? You just do step one and you just go and store that waste product somewhere to deal with it later. When you're going through the aerobic system, you do step 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, and you end up with carbon dioxide and water and energy, which you just breathe out. So they are actually two parts of exactly the same cycle, the Krebs cycle. Now, obviously, this graph, like I said, shows how they work each individually, but the actual reality is they work together all the time. So whenever you're doing any kind of movement, there's always going to be a little bit of anaerobic respiration going on and a little bit of aerobic respiration going on. And there'll probably be a little bit of this sort of creatine phosphate going on as well. And we'll talk about this in the muscle fibers bit. But different muscles could be using different systems at the same time. Little stabilizing muscles may be working up here just to keep you kind of level. Like if you're running and you've got just like ankle bits firing every few seconds, whereas these systems might be working to keep your core muscle groups actually moving and keeping you going. So all of this is working at the same time. It's not like it's not like, and this is a common misconception, certainly when I was at school, it's not like you sort of, in a 2K race, you don't sort of do the first minute anaerobically and then the middle bit aerobically and then the last bit anaerobically. That's not really what's going on. They're all just producing energy at different rates and feeding into the system at different levels. So it's a mixture. So that's what this useful little chart shows. The different proportions of energy for roughly for different types of exercise. So, like just weightlifting is going to be entirely non-aerobic, right? If you're going in and just doing like sets of 3 or something like that, it's never going to even be long enough for that system to get going. But, it will be 100% anaerobic without any lactate, right? It's creating phosphate all the way down here to a marathon distance. So a marathon distance is a good level for it being essentially 100% aerobic. It's not actually going to be 100% aerobic, but so much of your energy is going to have to be produced aerobically. We do have a 2,000 meter row in here. It's normally pitched at around that sort of 60-70% aerobic mark. But what that means is that during a 2,000 meter row, the total energy you expend, 60 to 70% of it is going to come from your aerobic system, and 30-40% of it is going to come from your anaerobic system. But that's going to be across the whole race, not just one bit after the other. It's not like an on-off process. Now, the way you pace a 2,000 meters may push some of that energy requirement earlier or later. So if you go off really, really hard, we go back to our graph up here, because of the time it takes for these systems to actually turn on. If you go off really, really hard, your lactic acid anaerobic system is going to have to take the work on early before your aerobic system actually gets started. So that's why if you do your first minute like super hard, you sort of blow, and that's because what you've done is you've just knocked out one of your subsystems that was going to be taking on some of the strain later on. You've just burnt it out and it's got to recover, while the other one takes the strain, and the other one can work at a much lower level, and then it sort of comes back later. But if you were to pace it at, not necessarily like flat, but just a little more conservatively, you wouldn't completely burn through this ability here, and you'd have that kind of sat under there to keep you going. So that keeping these systems in balance does become important for racing. It's also the reason why a good warm-up is important, because it does take time. It takes time for your aerobic system to even start producing energy, but then it takes even more time for it to sort of be comfortable and be just ticking over and be ready to go. So doing that warm-up, for 10, 15, 20 minutes is really there to switch this on and to switch this on, so that when you start racing, they're already sort of ticking over. It's a little bit, I mean, it's almost exactly the same actually. It's just going out on a cold day and starting your car and letting it sit running for a little bit so it warms up, so that it's all ready to drive off, rather than just driving it off cold. It's kind of exactly the same idea. So ultimately, we're going to be looking at these two, aerobic system and lactic acid system, because they're far and away the biggest, most important things for us. The last thing I guess to say about this is that a lot of this ultimately comes down to mitochondria, because they're the structure in the cell that does the aerobic respiration bit. That's just where it happens, and we're going to come around to mitochondria quite a lot in the next section. Next section. Okay. Any questions about any of that before I go on to slightly more detailed muscle fibers? That was your GCSE AS level bit. I try to avoid the A-level biology bit because I don't understand it either. So yeah, any questions on that? Cool.
Nope.
Oh, go on, Ben.
No, I just had no questions.
Oh, good. That's very kind of you.
You're very welcome.
Okay, muscle fibers. So this is another part of that story. So we've talked about what systems are actually going on, and this section is about what structures those systems are going on in. And this, for me, is quite an important sort of differentiator and quite an important element to consider when you're thinking about different training bands. We'll come on to that in a bit. So, in real brief overview, all of your muscles are not just solid blocks; they're made up of strands, of bundles of fibers. Talking about skeletal muscles, so muscles that move you around. Different strands, bundles of fibers, which can be made up of different types. And whenever you go to perform a motion, those fibers contract, they fire, and that produces the force that is needed to bend your joints. That's basically what's going on. And you may well have come across some of these in the past, and we'll explain a little bit about them. So this is a useful little table. So commonly we split fibers into two types, type 1 and type 2. And then that type 2 is split down further into sort of A or B, A or X, type 2, type 1, type 2, type 2. There are some people who will split this down even further into really sort of detailed, granular different types of fibers that have very specific roles and do very specific things. But for our purposes, each of these types does something that is like clearly distinct. And we can sort of sit at this level. And this is probably the level that most people actually doing exercise will go to. So type 1 fibers are what you probably know as slow twitch muscle fibers. So they're used for what we would call low intensity effort, and low intensity effort is everything from staying sitting up to sort of, I guess, what we would call UT2. So it's a wide range of low intensity effort. So we use them all the time, literally all the time. They have a slow contraction time. I mean, slow here is relative, right? So, we're talking 2 seconds versus 1 second kind of slow. They have a high oxidative capacity, so this is what's really important for us. They are the main store of mitochondria. So of all these three muscle fibers, in each cell of this fiber, there's a lot of mitochondria. So we can describe these things as they like to produce energy aerobically. When they try and fire, their preference is to produce energy aerobically. They have a small diameter, so they're not they don't get bigger very easily. They have a high resistance to fatigue. A lot of that really is because of this high oxidative capacity. And they generate a small force. But again, small force is relative. Small force is 60% of your maximum power output. It's not like 10%. And I think that is where there is a very common misconception, particularly in rowers, that because it says slow and because it says small, that means they're useless. But we're actually talking slow and small is still 60-70% of your like 1 rep max power clean. It's not just walking pace. That's not what we mean at all. Type 2 muscle fibers are what you probably commonly know as fast twitch muscle fibers. So let's talk about 2B first, because they're like classic fast twitch muscle fibers. So they're very, very fast. They have almost no mitochondria in them. So they like to respire entirely anaerobically if they can. They generally have quite a large diameter. They have basically no resistance to fatigue. They just sort of tire almost instantly, and they can produce a very high amount of force. So if we're thinking about that energy system graph, they like to use those anaerobic systems where they just burn through energy really, really quickly, produce a lot of force, and then stop and recover. So if we're thinking about weightlifting particularly, these are the fibers that are doing that. And then we have type 2b. So these are called type 2a, sorry. So these are called mitochondrialized fast twitch muscle fibers, or oxidative glycolytic fast twitch muscle fibers. So these are fast twitch muscle fibers that have picked up some mitochondria. So for one reason or another, they've sort of gathered up some mitochondria, and they can sort of do a little bit of both. So they can produce quite a lot of force. They're quite resistant to fatigue. They're medium sized. They have, I mean, again, it says here high oxidative capacity. I'd describe that as sort of medium. It's high for a person that spends their entire time sat on their ass, but it's not that high for an endurance athlete. And they have a good contraction time. So these are kind of in the middle. Most people have a pretty even split between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. Like if you're just a person sat around, you have an approximately 50-50 composition of these two. There is some genetic factor in that. There will be some people who are a little bit predisposed one side or the other. There will be some people who are a little bit predisposed between type 2A and type 2B. And there is some amount of plasticity from training. So muscle fibers can sort of switch type over time. And again, particularly between type 2A and type 2B, a little bit less between 2 and 1. But we are generally sort of saying that we get what we're given and we train what we're given. And that's going to be enough for most people, you know, unless you're really at the bleeding edge of your ability, you know, unless you're really trying to win Olympic weightlifting or a powerlifting competition, or, you know, run a 2-hour marathon. The genetic component is not particularly important. The training component really is. And training those fiber types, for me, is the big difference between being an athlete, even a club athlete doing it in your spare time, rather than being just a general gym goer doing stuff for fitness. You know, that's the difference between training for performance and training because the NHS says that you should do 20-30 minutes of fast-paced exercise 5 times a week, right? That's the difference for us. So getting on board with the fact that when we do our training, we are actually targeting things for reasons is, for me, is quite important to understand. And then something else to consider with these, you know, we've talked about type 1 liking to respire aerobically, type 2A like to do a little bit of both, and type 2B like to only respire anaerobically. That brings on to a concept which starts to become more important for rowers, particularly mid-distance endurance athletes, and that's the lactate vacuum, or Henry Hoover. So we mentioned at the top that anaerobic respiration is essentially the first step in the cycle of aerobic respiration, right? Your body takes some glucose, it snaps it in half, it produces a bit of energy and some waste products that it then sort of parks somewhere else to deal with. And then there is a series of chemical changes that output can be put through to do the rest of the cycle and just leave you with easy to deal with things like carbon dioxide and water. So that first step produces what's called pyruvate, and that has like a 1-to-1 swap with lactate. So it can be stored as lactate or it can be used as pyruvate, and effectively for our purposes they are exactly the same thing. The transfer between them is almost instant, and it doesn't really cost your body anything to switch between those two molecules. So we just treat them as the same thing. That switch is where the sort of lactic acidosis comes into, and you can get really down into free hydrogen ions and where they go and what they're dealt with, and it starts to, you go down a rabbit hole really quickly of biochemistry, which I get pretty lost with. But for our purposes, if you see pyruvate and you see lactate, they are the same. They mean the same thing. What that means is that lactate isn't just an end product. It's not just something that you produce and have and deal with, which is the way we normally talk about it, right? We normally think that we produce lactate and that's a bad thing. The reality is that it's also an energy source for aerobic respiration. So it's not just something that is stored and parked and dealt with, it's also cleared, right? We actually get rid of it, and we get rid of it by burning it for energy. One of the ways it can be got rid of is by using it to complete the cycle. So we know that during exercise, we're using both energy systems all the time. They're both doing a little bit of work. And one of the ways that those systems are balanced out is that lactate can be created by one process or one muscle fiber, transported to another one, and then used there. Lactate can only be absorbed and used by mitochondria because they're the structure that is actually doing that process. So we can think of muscle fibers preferring to donate lactate and muscle fibers preferring to receive lactate. So those that have got a low level of mitochondria will respire anaerobically, produce lactate, and give it to the ones that have got a high level of mitochondria who'll then burn through it. That's the lactate vacuum, right? So your slow twitch muscle fibers with all their mitochondria are absorbing the lactate being produced by your faster twitch muscle fibers. So when we talk about building a base and what that means, it has two parts to it. One, you have more mitochondria to produce energy, so you have like more factories to be producing energy, but it also means you have a bigger vacuum to support the faster systems. So they're not like they do actively support each other. There is a chemical level, biological level at which those two are supporting each other. So this vacuum is part of what's called the lactate shuttle, which you may hear about every now and then. So that's the process by which your body moves lactate around to those different systems, and certain types of training can improve that process. So when we're doing like TR training, high intensity training, one of the things that does is it improves your body's ability to respire anaerobically, take that lactate, give it to mitochondria, and get rid of it. But when we're doing lower intensity training, we're improving our ability to do that getting rid of part. We're improving the vacuum. So it means that those slow twitch muscle fibers, even though they're slow, and they're really there for sitting on your ass and running a marathon, are useful to people like rowers who are doing mid-distance endurance events. So they are of high value to us, even though on paper they don't seem to describe the kind of exercise that we ultimately want to be doing. It also means another, I think, misconception that does go around the general population is that lactate or lactic acid is classically blamed for exhaustion, right? You get lactic-y and you have to stop. And that's a bit of an old-fashioned way of thinking. So the argument used to go that lactate is stored as lactic acid because it needs to be kept in something, that builds up in your muscles, and eventually your cells become too acidic for the enzymes that are in them to do the work. So enzymes, some of you may remember from GCSE biology, have a preferred temperature and acidity range to work in. So they like, enzymes in your stomach like to be acidic. If they come out of your stomach, they stop working. And it was the same argument being used that enzymes in your cells like to be at a certain pH level. And if you get too lactic-y, it gets too acidic and they stop working. That's generally not considered to be true, although I'm not sure there's a good, certainly not a good explanation of what's actually going on at our level, our level of understanding. I think it's still quite complex. But what does matter is, even if it's not the cause, lactic acid concentrations or lactate concentrations are still a good proxy for what's going on. So we know as lactate goes up, you get tired. It doesn't really matter what the process is that's causing that. We just know that it's what happens. It's sort of similar to, like, you don't need to be an electrician to use a light switch, and you don't need to be a physicist to be an electrician. We don't need to know the low level effect to know that as your lactate goes up, you get tired quicker. It also means that production of lactate isn't a bad thing. In fact, if you want to be a good endurance athlete, especially over medium distances, you need to be able to produce lactate, because if you produce lactate, that's feeding your aerobic system, and it's allowing your fast twitch muscle fibers to be brought into the game. So it is important that we don't just do UT2 all the time. Like, if we just do UT2, you lose the ability to produce lactate and you get slow at 2K distances. But similarly, if you only do 2K distances, you lose the ability to vacuum up that lactate, and you just hit like a hard ceiling where you just can't get any faster because you've got no base. So when we talk about base building and we talk about why that's important, this is one of the reasons as to why that actually matters and why it's beneficial to you. Nothing to say about what's a good way of going about doing that, but a description of why that sort of matters. Any questions on any of that? Got a lot denser, a lot quicker, right? Okay, cool. Last bit, we're going to talk about the lactate curve. So we're going to talk about this because, again, it's a good descriptor, and it's something that a number of you, I'm sure, will come across or have come across in rowing, because it's often seen as the thing to look at in endurance sport. So lactate curve is a description of blood lactate levels for a given power output under an extended duration of exercise. So when we're looking at the curve, there's an assumption in there that you're performing exercise for longer than 30 seconds, right? Normally, you don't want to get too into testing protocols, but like a normal ramp up test for lactate testing is going to be like 4-minute blocks. So you do 4 minutes at different levels. There are loads of other ways of doing it, but we're sort of assuming that you're going for a little while. It describes push and pull factors of lactate caused by aerobic and anaerobic respiration. That's really what it's trying to do. So, and we'll talk through what I mean about that. And it makes for a good descriptor of the balance of input. So at certain points on that curve, it's going to describe certain amounts of balance in input from those systems, and then certain amounts of lack of balance. So that's what that graph is showing you. So here it is again. So we can see on the x-axis, you've got power in watts. That can also be like speed or anything like that, whatever is the relevant metric for the sport that you're doing. And then on the y-axis, you've got the concentration in your blood of lactate in millimole per liter. So when we talk about 2 millimole or 4 millimole or whatever, they're saying that in your blood at any given time, there's that amount of lactate is being moved around in your bloodstream or stored in your bloodstream. And that's being done for a given amount of power output for an amount of time. So you can see there's different points on this graph. So if you were doing a test, you'd maybe do a piece at 180 watts, and then somebody would take your lactate, and then you do a test at 240 watts, and someone would take your lactate, 270, take your lactate, and they'd keep going, and then you do a test at like whatever you've got left for the last 4 minutes, and they take your lactate. And then you plot that on a graph, and you get a curve, and it normally looks something like this. I just grabbed this from the internet from a random website. It will have on it somewhere an inflection point. I've said it's here for this graph. I think it's probably pretty good. Somewhere in this curve, there's a point where it goes from being kind of flat to straight up. That's your anaerobic threshold. So when we talk about AT training, that's what we're talking about, is that inflection point. It is typically described as being at 4 millimole. That's normally where people say it is. You can actually see on this graph, it's quite a bit below 4 millimole. That's not going to be true for almost anybody. The 4 millimole number comes from a, I think, German guy in the 80s who sort of wrote a paper basically saying, we did some lactate testing. There was an inflection point. It was at 4 millimole. And everybody went, the inflection point is at 4 millimole for all people in the world always. That must be it. Like a lot of sports science, it's sort of an East German paper in the 80s described it, and now it's truth. Like 220 minus your age for your maximum heart rate. The reality is that inflection point can be really different. Some people can tolerate quite a lot of lactate concentration before it starts to get out of control. Even as high as sort of 6, 7, 8, and some people can handle very little. But we typically just talk about 4 because it's the number. So, if you ever go for one of these tests, some of you may have been for one of these tests before, that 4 number may not be what you end up with, but we are talking about the same thing, right? So if we're describing the curve as just 2 lines with a point in the middle, you're going to have some bits of graph below that point where lactate doesn't really increase in terms of the power improvement. So power goes up, but particularly down here for this guy down here at just below 2, like nothing's really happening with lactate levels, or woman, I don't know, gender neutral athlete. And above that threshold, it rises rapidly. And the longer you keep going, it'll just go up and up and up. So as you go above this threshold, it just keeps going up until you stop, basically. You might notice there's a little bit of a tick down here at a very, very low level. That's, if we're going back all the way back up to that aerobic anaerobic graph, that's the sort of aerobic system hasn't got going yet. Anaerobic system has to do some of the work, but there's no vacuum yet to absorb the lactate. So very, very low intensity early on in the piece of work, slightly higher lactate levels because its anaerobic system's kicked in, it's produced a load of lactate, but its aerobic system hasn't switched on to start dealing with that. If you think about that from like a day-to-day perspective, your body doesn't expect all of this shit that's going to come next, right? It just says, right, we've got to do some exercise. Okay, I need this amount of energy and I need it right now, go. And then it handles the rest of the future later on. And that's what's going on with this little tick down here. So basically flat, steep rise afterwards. UT2, our good friend, we typically describe as being below 2 millimole. Now, again, that number can vary from person to person, but, and we'll come on to this later, is a little bit more set in stone than the 4 millimole number. So it's kind of fairer to say that most people have this block at and below 2 millimole, and then they have a block which can be any size between 2 and the inflection point, and then they have after the inflection point. So we can split it into those 3, and it's normally that middle block that can be randomly sized. Now, you may reach that 2 millimole at a very low intensity because you have no slow twitch muscle fibers and they're poorly trained and there's nothing going on and you have no hoover. So the graph can be shifted towards the left, or you could be an ultra endurance athlete and have only slow twitch muscle fibers and it's shifted towards the right. But 2 millimole is generally our UT2 marker, and I will talk about that in a minute. So if we were to split this into how we describe our training bands on the graph, it looks a little bit like this. So you've got this great big block of, I've just called it UT2. We might talk about UT3. We might talk about anything like that, right? We break it down in lots of different ways. Different sports call it different things. Different sport, even different in, like rowing Canada has like level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the Aussies call it something else, and we call it this, and but UT2 at or below 2 millimole, and then we have UT1 and AT, which is that block in between, and then we have TRAN, which is the block above the threshold. There is also AL, so analactate. That's that creatine phosphate thing. That doesn't really feature on here at all, and it's just a separate thing entirely. So if we're placing those training bands on this graph, that's how we place them. All of the training done either above or below is broadly similar in terms of its effects. So if we're training below that 4 millimole threshold, everything we do down there is sort of approximately similar. And if we're training above that threshold, everything we do up there is also approximately similar. So this is where we're starting to get into nuance, right? I'm now about to tell you there's little difference between UT2 and UT1, and then I'm going to tell you that there is a big difference between UT2 and UT1. So it's going to be a roller coaster here. Strap yourselves in. So training below that threshold has pretty, the end goal of that training is pretty similar, right? Increased cardiovascular capacity, so bigger heart and lungs, right? You spend a long time breathing hard, and that encourages your heart to be bigger, encourages your lungs to be bigger. Increased capillary density, your blood pressure goes up, and you have higher requirements for blood to all of your muscles. So that encourages your blood vessels to grow into your muscles. You have higher capillary density. You get mitochondrialization, so you are asking your slow twitch muscle fibers to produce energy a lot, and your body goes, great, okay, to do that we need more mitochondria, let's add some more of those into there. All pretty much the same thing for all of those training bands. And then training above that threshold, improve lactate transport, so that shuttle is improved, so you're producing lactate and you're teaching your body that it needs to do something with it, so it gets better at doing that. Improved enzyme action for lactate clearance, so the actual enzymes that you need to do those things, your body goes, great, we need more of those, let's have more of them. So essentially, below this level you're improving that vacuum, and above this level you're adding more fuel into the top of that vacuum, is a good way of thinking about it. They're two halves of the same coin. When we do exercise in a predominantly anaerobic way, we're getting better at producing lactate and moving it into fibers with mitochondria to produce energy. So lactate is not a bad thing. And indeed, some of that is shown in the names of these training bands. So TR literally means transport. So it's transporting lactate, it's lactate shuttle. UT2, UT1 is oxygen utilization. So it's improving our ability to use oxygen right? To get it in, to get it through, and to produce energy out. So if they're the same, why do those thresholds really matter? If there is a balance, when, you know, if you're doing anaerobic work, if it's actually aerobic and anaerobic work at the same time, who cares? Like, why don't we just do AT all the time because it's in the middle? Why don't we just do TR? Just do TR. You know, we just do 4 minutes times X, and that's just the only training we do. And that's kind of the old school training approach, right? That's sort of, you know, what people were doing in the 80s, particularly, and then that sort of carried over into later training, particularly in schools. You know, as people left national squads and went and became teachers, and then that's what they did with school kids, and then those kids grew up and went and coached at universities, and that's what they did with their students, and that's sort of how that process has carried on throughout the last 30-40 years. But why do those thresholds matter, particularly the UT2 one? So, you know, we go back to some of those discussions at the top about slow twitch muscle fibers being slow, about, you know, the demands of an endurance race being X amount anaerobic, stuff like that. You know, why would I bother doing UT2? And it comes back around to muscle fibers. So training at different versions of these intensities is going to recruit different fibers at different rates. Your body likes to adapt to the training stimulus we give it. So it's not like your body's not particularly smart. It just does its best with what you give it. So if we want to get maximum adaptation from each of those bits, we need to give it multiple different training stimuli. You can't just give it one thing because you'll only get one adaptation. And that eventually we do get into discussing what's going to be the best way to get that adaptation and what's the balance of X, Y, and Z and how should it be structured. But I think for now it's good just to know that to maximize output, we need to give different inputs. The way I quite like to think about this, I'm sure you've all come across the sort of, you know, building a pyramid model of training, right? Where you build a big wide base and then you put a little bit of something else on top of it and a bit of something else on top of it and a little bit of something else on top, and you go fast. I prefer to think of it like a house building analogy. So the foundations, if you're building a house, the foundations and the ground floor, walls and that will be built out of something different to the upper floors and to the roof. You know, you're going to want to build your ground floor out of concrete or stone or something that's sort of resistant to the ground. And then you're going to want to build the rest of the house out of materials that are lighter or more flexible or prettier or waterproof or whatever. So when we talk about doing these different training zones, it's not just about building a big base, it's about building a big base out of something in particular. And that's the real distinction. So if we want to talk about UT2 versus UT1 versus AT, because I've just said they all do functionally the same thing on a lot of levels. So why are they different? We get a nice, probably quite fuzzy graph. That's right. So this graph is another, it's an illustration rather than an actual data graph. And it shows effective intensity on recruitment of muscle fibers. So for me, this graph was the real game changer for particularly UT2 versus UT1 training. So the x-axis is just a sort of arbitrary training intensity. Again, this graph assumes that you're doing training for like a duration. You know, it's like in a 20-minute session. And the y-axis is another arbitrary unit of muscle fibers recruited, right? So it's muscular fiber mitochondrial content, but what it means is like how much recruitment is going on of each muscle fiber type. So the orange line at the top describes your slow twitch muscle fibers, and the green line at the bottom describes your fast twitch muscle fibers, but particularly those intermediate ones, right? It's really talking about the intermediate ones, the ones that have got some mitochondria in, the ones that like to do both types of exercise, right? So what it's basically saying is, as your intensity goes up, so if we just assume that far left here is at rest, there's going to be a little bit of anaerobic stuff going on, to keep you sat up, and there's going to be a little bit of aerobic stuff going on. And as you increase that intensity, your slow twitch fibers start to take up the slack. They start to produce energy, so their recruitment goes up. And eventually it comes to a point where they can't really do any more because you've maxed them out. And then your anaerobic system, your fast twitch muscle fibers, need to start doing more work to take up that slack. So they start to get recruited as well. That recruitment process will continue until you can't recruit anymore, right? They're all being used all the time and you burn out, or you stop. You will eventually fatigue completely. So, the important sort of thing to think about with this is the way your body recruits fibers. It doesn't just sort of fire them all in one go. It will recruit the number that it needs to do the task. So it'll go, okay, I need to lift this much weight, and that is going to require 20% of my muscle fibers. And then you go to do that exercise again, and it goes, okay, we're going to use another 20%, and it'll pick a different 20% fibers. And then you do it a third time, and it goes, great, we've got to do it again. So it'll pick another 20, and so on. And it cycles around them all. And in between each one firing, the others are sort of resting. So if you've been doing it anaerobically, they'll fire, they'll use the energy they've got, and then the next ones will sort of recover, they'll shuttle lactate out, they'll get new fuel back in, they'll get ready to go again. So they go round and round and round. And above a certain level, when of power output, when that circle gets complete, your body will discover that the first bunch that it used haven't really recovered yet. So either you have to use 21% of your fibers, so it's not an even split, or the time between contractions is just too short for them to recover again. And you'll come back round and those fibers will now be a little bit fatigued. And then you'll keep going round and round and round. They get more and more fatigued until they stop. Right? You run out of gas. So for certain exercise, like if you're a weightlifter, one of the things that you want to do as a weightlifter is encourage your body to recruit more of those fibers on the first go, so that you lift more weight for one rep. Whereas for us, we want to sort of encourage them to use them in a slightly more sensible manner. So this graph is sort of where we can start to define our training bands a little more closely. So UT2 is sort of the point about where it says slow under slow twitch fibers. So it's sort of that point where there's high recruitment of slow twitch fibers, of aerobic fibers, but low recruitment of your fast twitch fibers. And then UT1 is sort of the area in between, where it's the fast twitch fibers have sort of got going and the slow twitch ones are pretty much maxed out. And then the AT is the point where all of those fibers are being used, but within that recovery cycle. So they're always recovered every time you come back around. This is a very, very, very simplistic way of describing it, but I think it's a good concept to have in your head. So what that means is that while all of these sessions have similar effects, you're going to be recruiting different numbers of fibers. They're going to have a different focus on an aspect of your muscle, and they're going to train a particular bit of your muscle slightly differently. So when we're training at that UT2 level, what we're actually trying to do is maximize slow twitch and minimize fast twitch, so that we're just training those slow twitch fibers. And training harder, going further towards the right on this graph, doesn't recruit any more slow twitch fibers because they're already maxed out at that quite low intensity. So if you're doing a UT2 session and I don't know, let's say your UT2 split is 2 minutes, and we know that factually it's 2 minutes. Going a 159 doesn't provide any more training stimulus at a UT2 level than 2 minutes did. It's actually not a better session at all. So we can start to think of these sessions or these training bands as like, what's the most efficient thing? So for a UT2 session, you have your perfect UT2 split. It is exactly what it is supposed to be. It is right on the line. And then either side of that, you have various degrees of worse training. So if you go to the left, if you train less hard, you're doing the same type of training, it's just not quite as good. You're not providing as much stimulus as you could, but you're providing the same stimulus. If you go to the right of the graph, you train harder, you start to provide a different stimulus to your muscles. You're doing different training. It's still going to have some of the same fundamental effects, but it is becoming progressively a different thing. So, for people that sort of do their UT2 particularly, just a little bit too hard all the time, you're actually doing it more wrong than if you did it just a little bit light all the time. Now, we can obviously get into how much UT2 you need to do or how much UT1 you need to do, what's most appropriate for an athlete of your level, and blah, 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 right? That is an entire long discussion. But my PowerPoint just closed. That was good of it. But the really important point with this is that if you do lower intensity aerobic training, it is actually a little bit different to doing medium level intensity training. The other kind of thing to consider, not so important for us, but can be quite important and maybe quite important if you're doing like 5K racing. Again, we're talking about your body being not that smart. It only reacts to what you give it. So if you give it a lot of UT1, mid-distance, mid-intensity training, you build up more of those intermediate fast twitch muscle fibers more, and you activate them earlier. And we know that they're more efficient than the really fast twitch fibers because they have some mitochondria, they can do some work, they are kind of resistant to fatigue, but they're not as good as the slow twitch ones. So you start to bring them into the game much earlier, much lower on, and you get tired quicker. So your capacity to produce power for like 5K, 40 minutes becomes capped because you're sort of relying on the wrong thing. You've started to build your foundation out of wood, and it's still a foundation. It's still there. Your house is still going to stand up, but it's not as good a house as if you'd built it out of concrete, right? That's sort of what we're thinking of. So those things, yes.
Can I ask a question?
You can ask a question. Better be a good one because this is being recorded.
Oh, it's a fucking great one. Can I ask when it comes to the whole pushing a UT2 split debate? Obviously, there's the idea that if you push your UT2 split gradually down and down and down, does that accustom your body to performing at a lower split, if you see what I mean? So if you gradually inch your splits down on the UT2, where you don't get the aerobic gains that you would in an easy UT2 session, does it help your body to get accustomed to erging at lower splits, for example?
So there's a multitude of answers to that question. So one is that there are obviously other things going on that isn't just this muscle fiber recruitment, and there can be some elements of you becoming sort of stagnant. You could become mentally stagnant. You can just sort of lose that ability to step on a session. There's also issues around variability between sessions, how recovered you are, and all kinds of stuff that may enable you to have a slightly better session still at a UT2 pace one day versus another. And we often we often describe these paces in terms of a split or a power output. So we go, your UT2 is at a 2-minute split. But the reality is your UT2 is at whatever level for that day produces 2 millimole of lactate. And on an erg, that is a 2-minute split today. As you do training at this level, and as you below on this lactate curve, and you get better at producing power aerobically, the inflection point here moves to the right, so you produce more power using the same muscle fibers. The problem is the way we measure that encourages you to just produce more power and hope you're using the same muscle fibers. Now, obviously, on our muscle fiber recruitment graph, if your UT2 is a 2-minute split, and we know that, right? Somehow we've done muscle biopsies. We literally know exactly how your muscle is performing for a given level of intensity, and we know it's 2-minute. If you do a 159.7, that's in reality not that much different. It's slightly wrong, but it's not really wrong. You're still going to be maxing out your slow twitch muscle fibers. They're still going to be getting faster. And you're not recruiting so many fast twitch ones that you're doing yourself actual harm in inverted commas. But it may come with a whole host of benefits to do with technique or mental strength or something that keeps you going. So the answer is sort of more complicated than just keep pushing on your UT2 split. I personally, particularly when I'm getting fitter, like to think of it as a discovery process rather than a goal-based process. So I'll get on the erg. Last week I did 2 minutes and my maximum heart rate was 150 and my average heart rate was 157. I'll do that split again. My maximum heart rate was 149 and my average heart rate was 144. I've discovered that I've got fitter. So the next session I go a little bit harder and I get that maximum heart rate of 149, average heart rate of 148 or whatever. Okay, I've clearly improved my capacity. This is now the level I can work at. Rather than today I'm going to do a 2-minute split. What's my heart rate? Oh, it's 150. Tomorrow I'm going to do a 159. What's my heart rate? Oh, it's 155. Oh, what do I do with that information? Right, it's a discovery process, not a driving process. Other sessions, this is where we're getting on to effective training sessions. Sessions above your threshold are different. You push them on, you actively try and go harder. When we do TR stuff, it's last week I went 145. Let's see if I can survive a 144. Yes, I can. Keep going. Different type of training.
So I guess it's more of a pushing your scores from below,
yes,
rather than going ahead of them and trying to drag your scores with it, if that makes sense.
Exactly, it is exactly that. That's spot on.
So what? Because obviously the people train. Obviously I didn't go to Brooks, but it seems like the training plans at Brooks is, they don't seem to do any UT2. All of their hour ergs are max, but they call it their UT2 sessions because it's 18. Obviously, so I guess it's just balancing out the gains you get from the adaptations, as you say, but then also the efficiency gains of working hard, and then that dragging your scores up.
Yeah, and there is good discussion about what is the best kinds of training for people at a given ability level. So again, this is where we're sort of starting to get into how do we apply this rather than what's going on. And I guess where some of the misconceptions do come from, right? So to answer that question sort of backwards, if I'm an elite athlete and I've been training for years and I train, I do 18 sessions a week or whatever, and I need to really heavily max min my training. I need to get the absolute most out of every session for what I'm trying to do. My best approach is going to be to do very light UT2 and very hard TR. I want to provide as much training stimulus at the, let's go to a slightly, at this top end to get the most out of that. And then I want to maximize my slow twitch fibers when I do my UT2 and get the most out of them. And I don't want them to cross over too much, because when I'm doing UT2, I'm not using my fast twitch fibers, which need time to recover. So my UT2 needs to stay really light so that I'm ready to do the harder session. And on top of that, in order to get more UT2 fit, I need to do an obscene amount of volume. I need to be doing 200K in a week, because I'm really pushing the envelope of that. Like, every session I do has to move me on. So you get into like doing a really heavily polarized session training plan, because you have to, and you'll do a little bit in the middle. And you'll have been training for so long, you'll probably have sort of maxed out those middle gains. Your UT1 and that probably isn't going to get much faster, because you're already really good at training hard. You're already, really technically developed. You can push hard. You're good at that. So you don't need to do a lot of that. If you're a less developed athlete, you're probably not doing as many training minutes. So it's not that doing more training doesn't push that aerobic envelope. It's that you don't need to do as much training. It's like you're at 50% of your capacity, and a little bit of training will get you to 51% of your capacity, rather than you're at 99% of your capacity and you need to somehow in the next 4 years get yourself to 100. You may not have maxed out your gains from that middle ground. You may not have maxed out mentality. I think a big thing at Brooks really isn't physiology, it's being bastard hard, right? That's really what they're going for, is being tougher than everybody else. Certainly historically, that's what they've gone for. And doing that mid UT1 pace is still improving your aerobic capacity. It is still maxing out your slow twitch fibers. It's not like it's not doing those things. It's just a different way of doing it. I mean, I would say that over time, Brooks have started doing their sessions more, covering more of the bases, particularly the guys at the top transitioning into GB have been doing more UT2, have been lactate testing, have been training properly. So it's not quite fair to say that they always do everything like we think they do. That they are doing something a little bit different now, especially at the top end, maybe not for the lower guys. But yeah, I mean, that is a genuine question, like how much of each thing do we do? I think for me, the answer is that there's value in doing all of these training bands, which is why we do all of these training bands. Yeah, it's a very roundabout way of, I think, answering some of your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Actually got through everything.
I think Sam put one in the chat.
I did it. I can't. Oh, I can see the chat. Is there a way to find the perfect split for UT2? Good question, Sam. Ish. I can get into. I'm not going to get into testing for training bands now, because that genuinely is an entire other talk. My honest opinion is that we want to look for good enough, and that for us, an even much higher level than us, good enough is sufficient. We don't need to find perfect. You don't even need to, you barely even need to find perfect if you're a GB international level athlete. Although they do try for it, right? They will do like lactate testing at the end of all their UT2, and they'll do it on the water, and they'll do it on the erg, and they'll do it on the bike, and they have somebody there wading out to the boat to clip their ears at the end of a paddle. Like they do that, but for us, that we're not pushing the envelope so closely. We're not at the bleeding edge of our fitness that we have to be bang on every day perfectly to know that, you know, we didn't exhaust our fast twitch fibers and tomorrow we're going to be able to do our 2K. Like, we don't need to know that. There's too many other factors. So good enough is good enough. And, you know, generally speaking, 55% of your 2K watts is going to be good enough. Or whatever it is, 75% of your max heart rate, can't remember, is good enough. And if you're kind of sticking to this principle where actually going a little bit slower is better than going a little bit faster for UT2 training, and you're sticking to this sort of process of discovery, and you're recognizing that it takes time, that's time in terms of minutes done per session, time in terms of minutes done per week, time in terms of years spent training, then you can get pretty close to what the limit's actually going to be. Sure, you can go out and you can pay for a lactate test. Plenty of people out there will do them, not at the moment, obviously, but they'll do them, and they'll give you a number, and you'll train to that number, and you'll come back and you test it again. That's fine, it's doable. But you know, you don't need to have exactly the right answer to do good training from this. And the time input required to do a load of lactate testing for all of you guys is not actually, like, you may want to know the answer, but it's not actually that beneficial for us. Like, taking a week off to do a step test, which is effectively what we have to do 3 or 4 times a year, is not worth our time, when we can just sort of say, well, it's probably 55% of that test you did or 60% of that test you did, and err on the side of caution and wear a heart rate monitor and think. That's sort of fine. It does sort of mean, you know, there is a trade-off here, right? Where I'm telling you to do your UT2 lighter, it does mean, generally speaking, you know, UT1, because we rate cap it and because it's for a long period of time, should be pretty much flat out. You know, if we do UT1 for an hour, that should be, you need to go and have a little lie down level of intensity. You know, the problems really arise when we start putting time limits on things, and I start saying, okay, do 20 minutes of UT1. You have to start, like, capping your work rate intentionally. But for like UT1, it's just like, do an hour at rate 20, don't die a little bit inside. Yeah, it's a good question, Sam. Yeah, I think the answer is you don't necessarily have to as tightly as you may assume. Any other questions?
Rumi, I just want to double check that the way my thinking is accurate. I know we've been talking about the best, like, split, but in my experience, I sort of start off at sort of 2 minutes, 2:02, and then as the hour, or, you know, sometimes hour and 20 minutes progress, I go from 2:02 to 2:14, and it sort of builds sort of naturally as the, you know, as I'm sort of holding the heart rate. Is that what the heart rate's for, or should you look more towards keeping the split balanced?
So that, yeah, again, that's a complicated question.
Sorry.
No, it's a good question, but it has a complicated answer. So I guess first things first, so heart rate is an okay measure of training intensity at low intensities. It's all right, it's good enough. And that's why I like you all to wear a heart rate monitor. And it is functionally or that we will get a better outcome if I tell you to stick to a heart rate and a split, in terms of you actually knowing what to do and some kind of certainty, than if I give you the sort of fluffy answer, which is, well, heart rate's not actually that useful. But heart rate has a number of other things that go into making it go up and down, which are nothing to do with training intensity. So it'll go up if you're stressed or tired, or the room you're in is really hot. It'll go up as you get dehydrated. So when you do a long UT2 session, you get dehydrated. That causes your blood pressure to come down a little bit, and your heart rate goes up to compensate, because it's like pumping against air. So it goes up a bit. That's called heart rate, like heart rate drift. So heart rate going up over a UT2 session for the same split doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it wrong. I need to fish something out, but I think that drift should be less than 10% across the duration of the piece. So if you did an hour of UT2, maybe it's 5%. I've got something somewhere I need to find. But if you did an hour of UT2 and you started off and your first 20-minute average was 155, and your second 20-minute average was 152, and your third 20-minute average was 154, your actual effort level is probably flat. It's just that other factors have caused your heart rate to go up. If you're doing that session and within 20 minutes your average heart rate goes from 150 to 170, you're definitely training too hard. So to answer your question, which is the converse, where you train lighter to make your heart rate go flat, right? That's essentially what you're saying. You're adapting to the same problem in a different way. And the answer probably is, if it's climbing so much that you need to really come off the gas, you probably need to start a little bit lighter, give that aerobic system time to start before you start measuring it, and then stay a little bit lighter throughout, rather than letting it move around too much.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Although, but technically speaking, you are sort of doing the right thing, though. You're just tiring yourself out in order to do it. So if you want a really extreme example, a good way to find, and I really, please don't anybody try, I mean, well, try it if you want, but a good way to find your UT2 split is to do, some of you will remember last year we did like 1 minute flat out pieces. Like absolutely, like every stroke is flat out. So you intentionally blow, like at 20 seconds, at 40 seconds, you blow. A good way to find your UT2 split is to do that and not stop at a minute. Just keep going. And at about 4 minutes, you will hit a floor, right? You'll be pulling literally as hard as you can go every stroke, but you'll be pulling like a 2 minute 3 split, absolutely maxed out. That's where you've completely exhausted your fast twitch muscle fibers. Your anaerobic system is dead, and you only have your slow twitch UT2 type fibers to fall back on. They're all you've got. That's your UT2 split. There it is. You found it in the worst way imaginable, but you found it. And that's effectively doing the same thing, right? But you're just coming from a slightly higher level to achieve that. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Cool.
I've just been sort of, since I've been at City, I've been not really paying much attention of the splits as I go through the hour.
Yeah.
But sort of just taking the final average.
Yeah.
And the final average has come down from 208, 209, and it's now sort of 205. Good. And it's 205, even though I am creeping into the 210, 211 for the last sort of 15 minutes.
So the answer there is, go off at a 205 and just stay there. I think again,
that's what you want. Okay, that's perfect.
Similar to Ben's question, we sort of start to talk about other effects of training. And, I think for long sessions, a good goal is to just keep the split as, a game you can play. How tight can you keep your split range? I certainly used to, some of you may have remembered this, Swiss does the same thing. Get really excited when you can do like a 4 by 20 minutes with the same meters for every 20 minutes and be dead at the end of it. Like that is something that genuinely fills me with joy. You know, so you know, that process of honing your ability to pull a split for a time is also important. So yeah, is that an I have to go? What's the question? Yeah, cool. Any final questions? Okay.
Can I have one more, or have I exhausted my
Go on.
questions?
You can have one more, but it has to be quick.
Can you explain the difference between bike, run, and ergo? So bike, my heart rate is like 125, yet my legs feel like I'm doing a 2K.
Yep, I can go some of the way to explaining that.
Okay.
So yeah, something I've not really touched on is these different training bands, the different rate of fiber recruitment, all that is sport specific. So you will be better or poorer conditioned to certain types of these of exercise, and they do have slightly different elements to them. So, you know, a really clear example, if you're on a road bike, you're sat down and you're bent over. So the distance between your heart and your feet is quite small, and you're only using your legs. If you're running, you're stood up the whole time, I hope. And the distance between your heart and your legs is quite long, but you're using all of your leg muscles and your core to keep yourself stable. And if you're rowing, you're sat down, but you're using your upper body as well. So you're using different muscles. There's different, you know, gravity is coming into effect, and you'll be more or less conditioned to some of those exercises. So your UT2 for being on the bike, that threshold will be different for running, for erging, for rowing versus erging as well. And you'll generally find your heart rate is a bit lower for the same amount of effort on a bike as it is, and it's a bit higher for the same amount of effort running, particularly for rowers, because we tend to be pretty shit runners. Our amount of required effort to achieve a given speed is quite high for running, whereas for an actual, you know, 57 kilogram runner, their given effort for the same speed is lower. So there are actual differences. Generally speaking, I would say compared to your erg, on the bike, knock 10 beats per minute off, and on the run, you can sort of add 5 to 10. But it does also depend how good a cyclist you are. You know, if you're already a really experienced cyclist, then you can probably just go harder for the same level of output. And then also with cycling, you know, the big difference is it's very, very, very quad based. You know, almost all of the power you produce is coming out of your quads in cycling. So you're only using one muscle group, and you've only got one set of slow twitch fibers and one set of fast twitch fibers to rely on. So it's always going to be a bit more horrible, I think. So yeah, the answer is bike, heart rate being a bit lower is fine, is expected, and run, heart rate being a little bit higher is expected. And if you were to do lactate testing to find your training bands, you'd need to do it for each of those sports separately to get the answer, not just like rowing and extrapolate. Cool.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom.
I'm going to stop it there because that's been quite long. I'll save these slides and put them up on Ludum, and I will put this recording somewhere. But hopefully it's been sort of useful to at least contextualize some of the other stuff that I talk about. And maybe another time we'll have a chat about different training plan approaches and what's good and what's bad and what's effective and what's not. But I'll save that for another day. Cool. Thanks very much, guys. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Cheers, bro.
Cheers, bro.
Cheers, bro.